Disney's Cruella, a novelization. Chapter 7. Estella stood in front of the Liberty department store. Her hands nervously tugged at the bottom of her shirt as she stood at the imposing Tudor facade. On either side of her, people brushed past, entering through the spinning doors and disappearing inside. For so long she had only dreamed of being a part of a place as spectacular as Liberty, and now it was about to become a reality. Before arriving for her first day, Estella had stopped by Regents Park. Over the years, she had made a tradition of going there with 2 cups of tea and saying, "Hello," to her mum. She'd fill Catherine in on a spectacularly good heist, or show her a sketch of a dress design that she was particularly fond of. It helped Estella feel close to her mum, even though she was gone. That day, she had sat on a bench in front of the fountain, a second cup of tea by her side. As she took a small sip, she said, "Mum, I've got my chance, the one I've always wanted." She smiled and lifted a hand to her red hair, as she imagined her mother's nose crinkling as she reminded her to be a kind girl. "I'm going to keep my head down and make it," she added. Then, with one quick cheers, she had put up teacups in her bag, stood up, and made her way to Liberty. Now all she had to do was walk through the doors. But her feet felt frozen. This was scarier than any heist with the gang, because this meant so much more. Taking a deep breath, she smoothed her hands over her shirt and walked inside. She gasped. She couldn't help it. She had been there a handful of times over the years, just to wander the aisles and pretend for a moment that this could be her life, and yet each visit to the store literally took her breath away. Its ceilings rose high into the air, melding Gothic style with modern metal and glittering glass. Carved wooden balconies encircled a huge multi-story atrium that was filled with every type of department imaginable. Slowly, Estella moved through the cosmetics section, past the jewelry counter, and by the racks of haute couture. Nearby, a group of eager young women were standing at the ready to help shoppers fulfill their every need. She scanned the area, looking for someone who might be able to help her, but all she saw were shoppers dressed to the nines, their arms full of bags. The richer patrons didn't even bother carrying their own goods. They had men dressed in Liberty uniforms following them, pushing carts or carrying arms full of clothes. "Estella?" At her name, Estella turned. A man, face pinched tight and a clipboard in hand, was staring at her. His foot tapped impatiently. This, Estella deduced, was her boss. She quickly walked over and fell into step behind him as he led her deeper into the bowels of the store. As he walked, he talked. Her job, he informed her, was not to dawdle among the departments. It was not to help with alterations or offer her advice on window design. Her job, he said, was far too much satisfaction, was to clean up after the patrons. Estella tried not to let her face show her surprise. She had just assumed she would be working in the fashion department. But she was wrong. Terribly wrong. Estella was working in the janitorial department. Shoving open the door to the employee bathroom, Estella pushed a bucket full of dirty water in front of her, frowning as she caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. The janitorial uniform was drab, and she was rather sure had not been washed in a decade. Her hair was falling out of its neat bun, and there were smudges of dirt on her cheeks. She glanced down at her hands. The lacquer she had put on that first day she had walked into Liberty had long since been chipped away. She grimaced. This was not her dream job. This was a nightmare. Every day since she had started, she had tried to sow the seeds for a swift exit from janitorial and into the fashion department. She had greeted salesgirls with smiles, offered up thoughts to the seamstresses sewing in the basement, even tried to integrate herself with the perfume girls, who only had to stand and spritz fragrance. But no matter what she did or who she talked to, she was met with the same cold, condescending stares. It was clear where Estella stood. The very bottom. Just then her boss, Gerald, whom she was pretty sure just stood about waiting to see if he could catch her messing up, walked by. He glanced at her and then looked down at his clipboard and checked something off. Just like the headmaster at school, Estella thought, marking me down in his record book. "Please, sir," she said, greeting Gerald as warmly as she could. Carefully putting down the garbage bag she had been taking to the dumpster, she approached him. "Sir," she went on, "I'm a dab hand with a needle. Perhaps alterations could use—" "Why are you talking and not cleaning?" Gerald answered. Estella sighed as he walked away. "You wouldn't regret it," she finished hopefully, but the man was too far away to hear. Turning, Estella picked up the bags and continued to the back alley. Hauling the garbage to the large dumpster, she struggled to lift the first one. It missed the dumpster completely and landed on the far side. Estella groaned, as if the day couldn't get any worse. "So it's glamorous, isn't it?" Turning, she saw Jasper and Horace standing in the alley, looking at her with amused expressions. "You forgot your lunch," Jasper added, holding up a brown bag. "How's it going?" Estella straightened her shoulders. She could answer honestly. The day had been awful so far, and she wanted to give up. Or she could do what her mom had always taught her, focus on the brighter side of things. She went with option 2. "It's a world of opportunity, just like you said. I will rise, trust me," she said, hoping to convince herself as much as them. "I am calm and patient." Both boys laughed. Those were not words typically associated with Estella. "I know you will," Jasper said, straightening his smile and giving her a nod. Estella shot him a grateful look, and as she did, she noticed Horace eyeing an open window above the dumpster. She shook her head. No. "No what?" Horace said, trying and failing to act innocent. "No, I'm not letting you in that window so you can try and crack the safe," Estella said. Horace shook his head. "That's not the angle?" "There's no angle!" Estella and Jasper shouted together. Laughing, Jasper tugged on Horace's sleeve, leading him away from Estella. At the end of the alley, he turned and lifted a hand to Estella. She raised one back. Sighing, Estella turned back to her task at hand and picked up the next trash bag, heaving it up toward the dumpster. This one hit the mark, but it also managed to hit a loose piece of metal sticking up. There was a ripping sound, and the bag opened, pouring orange peels, old coffee grounds, and other remnants all over her. "Really?" she shouted to no one in particular. Tossing the remaining bags into the dumpster, Estella turned to go back inside, covered in garbage. She needed to change. Now. But when she went to turn the handle, it wouldn't move. She was locked out. Estella groaned loudly. Finding the bright side was going to be hard. She turned from the door and walked down the alley to the front of Liberty. A few passers-by gave her curious looks, and she hunched her shoulders as if that could obscure the janitorial uniform and bits of trash sticking to her. Just as she reached the main doors, she spotted movement in one of the display windows. She lifted her eyes. A woman, not much older than her, was tentatively moving a mannequin's arm and then rearranging a scarf so that it draped lower on the left than the right. Estella shook her head. The window was awful. The clothing the woman had chosen was drab and uninspired. Even the furniture the stylist had chosen to create the space was dull. Nothing went together. There was no theme, no message. It was as though the stylist had closed their eyes and grabbed a handful of items and just thrown them on the mannequins. Before she knew what she was doing, Estella found herself tapping on the window. The woman looked up and cocked her head, confused. "I feel sad that you think that looks good," Estella said. "What?" the woman in the display window mouthed. "I feel sad that—" Estella stopped yelling as her boss walked into the display. She froze. His eyes met hers and narrowed. Crooking his finger, he gestured for her to get inside, She didn't need to hear him to know he meant now. Giving the terrible window one last pitying glance, Estella made her way back into the department store. Instead of keeping her head down and skirting along the side to the back area like she was sure her boss wanted, Estella took a deep breath, raised her head high, and sauntered right through the middle of the place. She was more than likely about to lose her job, so why not go out being true to who she was? And that was someone who knew fashion and didn't need this job. As she passed smartly dressed women, she nodded. "Afternoon," she said to one. "Lovely scarf," she said to another older patron, who was holding up 2 scarves underneath her wrinkled chins, trying to choose. "Whatever covers your neck more." This was met with a look of shock from the patron that made Estella smile. Finally, she reached her boss. She stopped and waited for the inevitable dressing down. "You have a circular slice of banana on your cheek," Gerald pointed out coldly. Estella removed the banana. Then, as her boss watched, she popped it into her mouth. She tried not to laugh outright at his look of disgust. She hadn't survived on the streets for as long as she had without growing a backbone that was clearly stronger than his. As if sensing something had changed in Estella, Gerald signaled for her to follow him to the office. "Finish out the day," he said, when they arrived and he had shut the door behind them. Walking toward his desk, he gave Estella a stern look as he said, "Clean my office from top to bottom, then give your uniform back and get a bus back to whatever tiny pathetic life you came from." Estella's head snapped up in her surprise. "That seemed uncalled for," she said. Figuring she had nothing left to lose, she added, "I think under that starchy half-size too small bum clincher of a suit might lurk a kind man who would like to give a brilliant kid another shot." Apparently, however, there was no kind man lurking anywhere. "Clean! Now!" A little while later, Estella surveyed Gerald's immaculate office. Outside, it was getting dark. Suddenly, Horace's words came back to her. "What's the angle?" Well, there hadn't been one. Not before, but maybe she had been too fast to brush that idea off. Maybe there was an angle she could work after all. Estella sighed with pleasure as she removed her smock and let her hair down from its elastic. It felt good to loosen up for a moment. Now, on to the real job. By the time she left the office, the moon was out and the store was empty. Estella made her way to the front of the store, jumping at its sounds as it settled into after-hours emptiness. Spotting the door to the display window, she shouted, "The sad, sad window!" She could fix it! Stepping into the storefront, she tiptoed over to the mannequin that had caught her eye earlier that day. Even in the dark, the outfit was atrocious. "I just can't leave you looking like that," she said to the inanimate figure. "It would be cruel." Tearing off the mannequin's hat, Estella got to work. Estella was having a terrible nightmare. She was in a dumpster, and someone kept hitting the sides of the large metal container. Bang, 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 over and over again. Why wouldn't they stop? In her nightmare, the banging grew louder and more insistent. Estella opened her mouth to scream, and then she woke up. Opening her eyes, Estella gasped. The banging hadn't been a nightmare. It had been Jasper and Horace. They were standing outside the window display staring at her, and they were accompanied by a crowd of onlookers growing by the moment. "Oh no, oh no, oh no!" Estella thought as she clambered to her feet. She must have fallen asleep after she'd finished playing with the window display. She turned and looked at the display. Despite the fear coursing through her, she couldn't help smiling. The window was brilliant. She had found a can of spray paint and graffitied the back wall. One of the mannequin's stodgy dresses had been replaced with a leather jacket, paired with proper trousers, while the other was dressed in neon. She had even managed to bring life to the furniture, adding pops of texture and color that clashed and yet went together. It was a whole new window, bright, bold, messy, and provocative. Estella bit her lip as she studied her work. Bright, bold, messy, and provocative was not exactly Liberty, but it was so her. She couldn't help smiling proudly. Turning to the mannequins, she winked. Seriously, how much better is that? You both look happier. Hearing a rap at the window, she held up a hand. Jasper and Horace could wait. I'll be out in a... The rapping continued. Estella looked over her shoulder and gulped. It wasn't Jasper. Or Horace. It was Gerald. Oh dear, she said. The man looked incensed. Sighing, Estella let herself out of the window display just as the front doors of Liberty opened for business. As crowds of people streamed in, she saw her boss making a beeline for her. You! He shouted. Stay there! I'm calling the police! Police? That seemed a bit much. She hadn't done anything except fix a fashion crime. Really, the stylist was the one who should be arrested. But apparently her boss didn't see it the same way. He kept shouting for the police. Estella turned. The security guards at the front door had spotted her and were moving toward her, and there were more emerging from the back of the store. She had nowhere to run. Spotting Horace, she saw that he had made his way inside and was now too busy picking her boss's pocket to help, and she couldn't see Jasper through the early morning rush of shoppers. Frantically, she tried to think of a plan, but escapes had always been Jasper's thing, not hers. She was fresh out of ideas. Suddenly, one of her boss's minions ran up to him. He was shaking, and his breath was coming in gasps. She's coming! The Baroness! At his words, her boss went pale. Spinning around, he clapped his hands together, the sound echoing through the store and making every employee, and a few customers, stop in their tracks. Battle stations, everyone! Gerald ordered. Estella wasn't about to miss an opportunity to jet. Turning, she ran, ducking down and hiding behind one of the overstuffed display cases. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, she finally spotted Jasper. He crawled over and crouched down next to her. Is there a back way out? He whispered. Estella shook her head. She didn't want a way out. Not yet, at least. Not until she saw her. Did you hear that? She asked, almost forgetting to keep her voice down. The Baroness. I want to see her. Jasper looked at her like she had gone mad. They're distracted, he hissed. Let's go! But Estella ignored him, her eyes trained on the front door. A moment later, a large bodyguard and two smaller security guards entered. The Baroness followed. Estella's breath hitched as she took in the fashion designer. She looked just like the images that plastered the front page of any society magazine or paper. Estella couldn't stop staring. The woman practically dripped condescension. Her mouth was pulled down in disdain, and her eyes were ice. But Estella barely registered that. All she saw was how impossibly chic the woman looked in her designer outfit. That's her, she said. Jasper rolled his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but was stopped by the sound of the Baroness's voice cutting across the atrium. Outside! She snapped. That window display! Nervously, the boss stepped forward. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice shaking. I can explain. Feeling a tug on her sleeve, Estella dragged her eyes from the pair. Jasper was frantically nodding toward the end of the display case. The security guards had spotted them. You're right, she said. Time to go.